Welcome once again to the J Lowe Artist YouTube channel. Thanks for joining me on this artistic adventure. Today we'll be working with ink, pen and ink. So have your kneaded eraser, a number 2 or an HB pencil handy, and any type of ink that you would like to use. But make sure that it's archival, that it's permanent, that it's black, and a smooth ink. And let's start doing some ink drawing.
We're going to start with our number 2 pencil, and we're going to do simple shapes. We got to figure out where our moose goes. So if you want, you can just start out and say, well, his body is going to be over here somewhere, and his rear end, I want to give him some more space over there, just a little bit, so maybe about right in there. His antlers are going to come up in here, and all I'm doing, I'm not drawing antlers, I'm just drawing little shapes that I think are kind of close to the size that I want them. There's your antlers. That makes his head about right in here. I could probably go up a little higher with those, maybe even. Maybe I'll move those antlers up a little bit. I'm just simple shapes. I just simple shapes. Here's his head. His body. There's a leg. There's a leg over here somewhere, right there, somewhere. So when you start that way, then you're saying, okay, this is how big I want it. This is kind of where I want him to have, all the action to happen in here. Then you start refining it. Here's the grass. I'm just going to do these little sketchy lines in there. Remember that everything you're going to draw here with your pencil gets erased. So don't get attached to it. It's all going to have ink. Because the antlers are important, I'm going to refine out where those go. They are as wide, if not just a little bit wider than his whole body. So they're going to go way out, just over his body, just a little bit. And they don't have to be perfect. We're just getting the gist of it. Trying to figure out where everything goes. The end of his antler, if you go straight up off of his nose, that's about where the end of that other antler goes. So you can figure out how wide it's going to be. From just outside his rear end to just about where his nose is. He's got some really weird antlers. I mean, they're not normal moose antlers. We'll name him Bullwinkle. I don't know if there's anything else that we need in there. And as I draw, I am not stuck to my initial pencil drawing. This is going to get erased. So I can always adjust. I like to start with the eye because the eye is important. It's kind of that central place. It's kind of where everybody looks. This is that 1/3 view, those antlers and that head. That's about our focal point, our emphasis area. So it's kind of up to you where you want to start. We can start with the antlers if you want. I'm going to move that eye over just a little bit. So, you guys ready for some magic? Rather than draw lines around the antlers, pick out the shadows, the darkest shapes. I'm going to start out with this little tiny shape right at the very top. And just do this little tiny shape right there. There's a little shadow a little ways down. I'm going to pick that one out. There's another little top right here. I'm going to pick that one out. The backside, our light source is coming from this direction, but the underside is in shadow, and so we get a little bit of shadow on the backside. So maybe some little dots, dashes. Here's another little shadow right next to that. I'm just going to put in that shape. Just draw the shapes of the shadows. Don't draw the antlers. Just draw the shape of the shadows. If you feel like you need something in there, a couple little dots or dashes, you can put some things in there. But for the most part, you want to just leave out as much as you can. Here's that underside, just this little shape. I'm just going to do little hatch lines. Some of those shapes are rather dark, so you can go in and cross-hatch through them. There's some grain. I don't know if you've ever felt an antler. There's a grain to it. It's almost like wood. But it feels like plastic. You can make lots of things out of antlers. You can heat them up and bend them. I'm just going to keep that little hatch line going in the shape that I see it. And there's a core shadow in there. It's a very dark core shadow. You can hatch through that, darken in that core shadow. Now, we can always come back into these and do more if we need to. I'm just drawing the shapes of darkness that I see. And I look at it and I have no idea what's going on in those antlers. But as you draw through them, you'll figure it out. So I'm going to get rid of the graphite. And really, that's what we've got there. Anytime you have some gray, you just hatch through it. I just use these little parallel lines. And if you're barely touching the paper, you're going to get a very light line. Sometimes that's better than a dark line. If you need a dark line, you can always go over it a couple of times to darken it in. But remember, I think most people go too far with their ink. So keep it simple. Now, there's a bunch that we can go back into it. That's a good start. Right in the middle of his head, where those two little shadows come up, that's his ear. And there's a lot of that that's really light. So I'm just going to do a couple little dots and dashes. Let me zoom into this so you can see what I'm doing. Little dots and dashes. Here's his ear, comes up, almost touches that other antler. Big long ear. Couple more little dots and dashes. And then there's a shadow that goes over that. So I'm just going to use this line to denote that shadow. So these little hatched lines, there's part of that shadow there, and part of that shadow underneath. And then the rest of that is kind of lost. There is a little bit more in there. You can go back into it if you want, do some little feathered lines. A feathered line is where you lay your pen in and then you give it a little flick. Flick, 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 flick. You can flick them up, you can flick them down, but you get very, very light lines. And that's a feathered line because it kind of is stronger to begin with. And then as you kind of pick up, it gets a little thinner. When you're doing fur, you want to flip those in the direction the fur goes. And fur never goes the same direction. So if I went like this, that would look like, you know, he went to the barber or something. That's just not how fur goes. So you want some to flip up, some to flip down. You want some short ones, some long ones. Okay, so when you're doing the edges, that's what you want. That feathered line, very soft. So I'm going to just a couple of little feathered lines here and there just to show where things are. There's his eyebrow. It's very light on that edge. And if your feathered line can go in the direction that the hair flows, it's going to give the illusion that that's fur. This is not easy. I know. I make everything look easy. That's what my wife says. But it takes a little skill, a little practice, and you'll get it. Like I say, I truly believe that you can do anything you want to. There's a ton of that other antler that is lost. It's hidden. It's just in the background. So a couple little dots and dashes. There's the tip of that one little horn, little antler. There's one. And then that whole backward, that comb in the back, boy, there's a lot there that's left out. So I'm just going to do a couple little dots and dashes. And as I come over, I can see the shadow from across his ear that hits that comb. See that shadow? And it's broken right there. I'm just going to put that in. So then this shadow kind of continues from his ear to the comb of his antler there. Isn't that what you call it? Any hunters out there? I think that's what you call it, is a comb. So here on the top, there's a little spine that comes off of there, but the spine is really light. So just leave it out. Just do the tip and maybe where it connects, and your eye makes that connection. If you need a little dot or a dash, you can put that in there. But everybody understands that that's what's going on there. You don't have to draw a line around everything. Just draw the darkest things you see. Anything that's not dark, leave it out. And then there's a bunch of texture in there. We can go in with little dots and dashes, but I can do that later too. I'm going to just get rid of the graphite just because it bothers me. There's another little shadow across his other antler right there. I'm just going to throw that in. The back side gets some shadow, but the front side is all light. I'm just going to leave it. And basically, that's the antlers. A lot that you can leave out. As far as his nose goes, his nose is defined by the shadow that's on his back. And so what I'm going to do is just do a couple little dots and dashes to just go, okay, his nose kind of comes down here like this. If this is not in the right place, I can adjust it. I can make it go somewhere else. I'm just going to define that edge with the little dots. So that's the edge of his nose. And then the rest of this is big dark shadow. I'm just going to define that down his back. I'm just going to use these lines, these hatched lines. And when you get to his back, because his back is soft, you do the feathered line coming out. You can just hatch through that blackness. You can do whatever you want to in there, but just make sure your edges have that little feathered line, and you've got it. Before I do his back, though, I want to do his head. His head is very important. People look at his head. That's the emphasis area. One of the big things is the eye. Maybe I'll zoom into his eye for you. A couple things I know about moose eyes. They're kind of like horse eyes. They're kind of very dark area. There's a little bit of white around there. Back in the 1870s, there were quite a few people who captured moose and trained them. You could ride a moose like a horse. You can have them pull wagons. I don't know if you knew that or not. Lots of old cowboy pictures of Montana, people riding moose. So just a couple little shades of dark and light right on the corners and right in where the tear duct is. And then that little half moon shape for the pupil. And maybe a dot or two just to show where that eye ends. And that's really it. The rest of the definition is done with little hatched lines to say there's fur under the eye there. Little feathered lines, little fur under the eye. And any place you see the darkness, go ahead and draw it in with those little feathered lines. Try to go in the direction that the hair flows. And if you want it to go darker, you just add more line. Just cross hatch through it or whatever you feel like you need to do. Those feathered lines just very soft. You barely even touch the paper. Try to practice that. That is a learned skill. Your pen will last longer too if you do. A little bit of gray in there, so I'm just going to go in with some little dots and dashes. Just make that little section light gray in there. There's some sections that are even darker, so just a couple more line over that. Under his antler is shadow of his ear. So I'm going to put that in really dark. I'm going to crosshatch through that because it's pretty dark. This is the line down his neck. Just a couple little dots and dashes. Use that feathered line. Remember, the edge is more important. Then we can fill it in. And if it's really light, less line. If it's darker, more line. Now, throughout this whole section is kind of gray. I can see some of that texture, but I want some of that grayness in there. So I'm going to just hatch through it. That whole section. And I know this looks kind of silly to begin with. But as I do line on top of that, it'll keep it nice and gray. And that's really what we want. And just little dashes, dots, anything that you think feels right with the texture. Just dots and dashes. So over the top of those little hatch lines, I'm just going to do some feathered line. Try to make it look like the fur. The nose is very light too, so you could just leave the nose out. It's defined by the shadow that's on underneath him as well. So I guess you could put that in if you want to, just by hatched lines. Because we're going to go back in there and get a bunch of that in there anyway. Little dots and dashes. And at some point, you're going to feel like we're just scribbling, which is really what we're doing. Just get enough dark and light that it looks right. So we've got our basic shapes in. That's what's important. Then you can go back in and just scribble in some more darkness. And when I say scribble, I mean it. You just kind of little lines. That feathered line, practice that on his fur. When you get to the edges, make sure those edges are those feathered lines, and you got it. I'm going to go back into his antlers, try to finish those antlers up. Dots and dashes. Are those the best antlers you've ever drawn or not drawn? The only antlers you've ever drawn, huh? I'm not sure I've ever drawn a moose before. No, that sounds weird, but I think this might be my first moose. I always get asked too, what's the hardest thing to draw? It's the thing you haven't drawn yet. And it's only hard because you've never drawn it. Once you've drawn it, then it's easy. Not easy. Then it's been done before. You know what to expect. When you get down to his legs, just leave a lot of that out at the bottom because we're going to do little weeds and stuff in there. So there's a ton of that you can just leave out. Time to get rid of the graphite. This is what I love about these pigment microns. You can go over the top with your kneaded eraser. Never have to worry about your ink smearing. The little weeds are going to be easy to do. You just do the little shapes of darkness. Don't try to do the weeds themselves. Just go in between. So you just kind of do little shapes of darkness. And you can have them just kind of hanging out there. So there's your weeds. Kind of like how we did trees. You can have them just kind of there. And you don't even have to follow what the weeds look like, because little spots just hanging up there. If you want to do a couple little lines coming through there, you're welcome to. Don't do too many of those. He's not standing in spaghetti. And you just simplify it. Just like that. Just simplify it. And hopefully you learned how to scribble. It's very therapeutic, by the way. A good place for a signature would be right there, right above those weeds. That would be a good place for it. So we're just scribbling through everything. Lots and lots of scribbles. You just need it to go as dark as you need it to go. We could work on this for another 20 minutes, but hopefully you kind of get the gist of it and you get the idea of what we're trying to accomplish. The darks and the lights. And if you were out in the meadow on a mountain and a moose came up to you, it was just sitting there minding its own business, and you happen to have pen and ink, it might be kind of fun to whip out your pen and ink and draw it. Or take a picture of it and go home and draw it. Imagine how Lewis and Clark felt when they first saw a moose. They didn't have cameras, but they did have guns. They might have shot one. Like I say, you could take this as far as you want it to go, as dark as you want it to go. But it's all about practice. I hope you've enjoyed your time with me today. I hope you've learned something and did something maybe you've never done before. I hope somewhere along the way you have felt that this has been something that made your life a little bit nicer. Because art makes life better.